Good morning, everyone, and welcome to the Hemp Grower Spotlight. I am your host, commercial agriculture educator Phillip Alberti. This webinar series will serve as a platform for our local producers and allow other growers, agribusiness professionals, and private industry to come together to discuss agriculture. Today's episode will feature Rock River Labs and their spinoff cannabis testing company, Pride Analytics and Consulting, who have been serving the laboratory needs of the agricultural community for more than 40 years. In 2019, they were the highest volume hemp testing lab in Wisconsin with more than 3,500 samples processed. And today our guests include Dustin Sawyer, Scott Fleming, and Ava Lynch, who will share the trends from the data collected in 2019 and take your questions about what to expect from the testing labs in 2020 and beyond. Throughout the educational program, participants will be allowed and encouraged to contribute to a live Q&A with our guests via the chat box, and the webinar will be posted online at go.illinois.edu/spotlight shortly following the program. Please take a moment to confirm that your microphones are muted and videos are off to enable a smoother viewing experience for all. And with that, let's go ahead and get started. So good morning, Dustin, Ava, and Scott. I'm going to go ahead and kick it over to you and let you start sharing your screen and just start telling us a little bit about who you are, what you do, and what we can expect for the 2020 growing season.
Good morning, everybody. Let's see. All right, is my screen sharing properly, and can everybody hear me?
That's perfect.
All right. Thank you very much for the invitation to share this data with the community. I think that we'll find the data are actually pretty exciting, and it leaves us hungry for more, for sure, for upcoming seasons. So what we wanted to do in 2019, with this being the first real growing season, at least for Wisconsin, is we found there was a deficit of knowledge in terms of how to produce hemp and how to test it and what exactly we can expect out of varieties and genetics and things like that. So our one of our bigger goals for 2019 was to just look back at the data that we collected and see if there were any useful information in there. We'll get started quick with a brief background. So you'll hear the names of two different laboratories throughout this presentation. Rock River Laboratory is the parent company that both Scott and Eva and I all work for. Rock River Laboratory has been around since 1976. We're an agricultural testing laboratory that specializes in animal nutrition as well as soil testing. So on the soil testing side, we need to maintain a certification through the Department of Ag, the Wisconsin Department of Ag, also known as DATCAP. And we've had that certification since opening, so more than 43 years now. We test more than 150,000 soil samples every year, and probably close to 100,000 feed samples, animal feed samples every year. We have 9 locations in the US and 5 locations internationally. So that is to say the team here is not new to agriculture, and we are not new to the laboratory testing industry. As it turned out, when the 2018 Farm Bill had passed, some of us at Rock River Laboratory had already been interested in, the cannabis testing. We found that in both medical and recreational cannabis, there was a pretty large deficit of knowledge, customer service, and expertise on the laboratory side. So we had already been investigating that when the 2018 Farm Bill came to fruition and the Wisconsin Hemp Pilot Program came to fruition. So we were able to hit the ground running through our spinoff company called Pride Analytics and Consulting. This was founded in 2018 with a focus on cannabis and hemp testing, primarily for bank reasons. It's a completely separate company from Rock River Laboratory, although the personnel and expertise remains the same. We have a location here in Watertown, Wisconsin, which is where Eva, Scott, and I are located. And we also have a full recreational marijuana lab located in Cathedral City, California. Brief background on the team that will be here for your questions and answers today. Eva Lynch is our lead scientist in the laboratory. She's got a wealth of knowledge in analytical instrumentation and method development, and a strong background in biotech. Scott Fleming is an agronomic, guru. He's our field agronomic specialist, and He spent a lot of time in production agriculture, knows a lot about the equipment, a lot about the practices and the fertilization. So he's really our boots on the ground, out in the field expertise. And I have been with Rock River Lab for just over 14 years now, currently serving as lab director with a background in soil science and chemistry. Real quick, before we dive in, it's important to understand exactly where we stand right now with federal regulation. So I think everybody understands the 2014 Farm Bill is where this all began. It allowed states to begin hemp pilot programs, but that really didn't kick off until 2018 when the 2018 Farm Bill redefined hemp as an agricultural crop. And this is the really important part for folks to understand is we hear a lot of questions about where did that 0.3 come from? The federal government really likes to work on precedent, and there was a precedent set in the 1946 Agricultural Marketing Act, and there is where the Delta-9 THC content of 0.3% came into play. So that is what we're going off of, is the 1946 Agricultural Marketing Act. The USDA was required to develop rules for how we're going to distinguish between hemp and marijuana production. And at the end of October, they released their interim final rule. And that final rule turned out to actually be pretty burdensome, not only to growers, but also to laboratories. There's definitely more to come. Some things have changed since that first came out. And by the end of 2020, we should have a much better idea of what's going to be the permanent rule. Do we have any questions at the moment?
Not so far.
All right. So we're going to be talking about hemp testing today. And there's really three kinds of testing that we can do for hemp. We have agronomic testing, quality control testing, and health and safety. I'll give a brief overview of each one of these testing options, and then we'll dive a little bit deeper into what we saw for quality control and health and safety testing in 2019. So the first testing option being agronomic testing, and I listed this first for a couple of reasons. First, it's where a grower should start before the seed hits the ground, and also because it's the least expensive option of all three options. So what is agronomic testing? First is soil testing, and this is to look at what is the availability of plant nutrients in the soil and what fertilizer should actually be applied. It's much better to know what you're doing than to blindly apply fertilizer, because that can be detrimental to the crop. And in the case of hemp, that could actually also result in the crop going hot. Plant tissue analysis. This is looking at the plant during the growing season. So an actively growing plant, we snip some leaves off of the plant and we analyze those to see how much of the nutrients are actually being taken up by the plant. So this is kind of like a health checkup in season. And also irrigation water analysis. If you're irrigating your plants, you want to make sure you know what's going on there. Sometimes tainted irrigation could cause plant sickness issues. It could be bringing heavy metals or other contaminants into your plant. So knowing what's going into your plants is important. The primary benefits of agronomic testing mainly is going to be financial. You're going to be maximizing the efficacy of your growing operation. So it's really watching the bottom line on what you're spending and what you're getting out. And that'll lead to healthier plants with a greater yield. And also looking at the irrigation water analysis, you're going to be helping to mitigate the risks of health and safety issues in your harvested plant. We did not get very many requests for agronomic testing on hemp in 2019, so we really don't have any data to review here. Any questions on agronomic testing?
Nope, bro. Keep going.
All right, so the second type of testing that you may be more familiar with is going to be quality control. And the biggest one in quality control is going to be cannabinoids. So this is monitoring our cannabinoid levels in season as a way to time harvest, also to get a valuation of what the harvested material is going to be, ultimately to get a certificate of commerce. And after harvest, this comes into play after post-extraction. for product development and formulation. Other quality control measures to look at is going to be moisture. So this is going to be also to help harvest timing, time harvest. We're going to want to monitor the curing process after that material has been harvested. And we're also going to use moisture to determine the risk level for mold and bacteria. A more advanced type of quality control testing that not everybody is doing, this is more for a niche market, is going to be terpenes. And this is for product development and formulation, again, to really try to fine tune your development. Primary benefits, you'll see there's an asterisk on cannabinoids here. And I'll only say this once, but it really does ring true that Agricultural Marketing Act of 1946 definition of hemp is a slam dunk if you're growing industrial hemp, or what I call industrial hemp, which is fiber, seed, food, anything but CBD. So if you're growing industrial hemp, then this cannabinoid is the only QC test that you need. None of these other ones really matter. But obviously the primary benefit to that is going to be regulatory compliance. Then you've got harvest timing, production formulation, and finally product valuation. So let's dive a little bit deeper into the quality control testing, specifically cannabinoids testing. It's a really pretty straightforward process, has a pretty small footprint in the lab. And here's a quick flow chart of how the samples are processed. We'll log them in, then we send them through a drying process, and that's how we determine the moisture of the sample. After the sample has been dried, we'll crush it, we'll pull a subsample, we extract the cannabinoids, we have to go through a dilution step, and then we'll analyze it. This instrument here is called a high performance liquid chromatography, or HPLC, maybe a term that you've heard in the industry, but this is our analyzer. We review the data and finally report. So really not a complex process, but it is fairly tedious. Also important to note for potency testing and really any kind of testing in the hemp industry, there are no official procedures for any of it. At this point, there's no overarching body that is governing how cannabinoid testing is being done. There's no set procedure, and laboratories can do essentially whatever they want. Eva and I have been on the forefront of trying to get this standardized. The Association of Official Analytical Chemists, or AOAC, has been working to implement a standardized procedure for hemp potency and getting very close to having that procedure. They've already gone through a process for potency in cannabis, but not in hemp. So that procedure is AOAC 2018.11. And this is the procedure that Pride Analytics and Consulting is using right now. And in the end, I'm sure the hemp procedure is going to be very similar to this. It'll just have different performance standards for CBD, CBN, CBG, all of the cannabinoids that are of interest in hemp that are not really of interest in cannabis. Currently, there's only one proficiency testing program that's being run in the industry, and it's being implemented by the University of Kentucky. We'll do a quick recap of the cannabinoids of interest, just as a part of the overall testing procedure. So I don't need to belabor this. Everybody on the series here understands what we're looking at. The important thing is understanding the role of decarboxylation, and that's converting the THC-A form to delta-9 THC, or the CBD-A form to standard CBD. There are two ways to get at what is called total THC. The first is to send the sample or the material through this decarboxylation process as part of the testing procedure. And then you would have all of your THC would be delta-9, all of your CBD would be CBD. The second way is to use the stoichiometric formulas that you have here. This is the way that we do it here at Pride Analytics and Consulting, and it's probably going to become the industry standard. Do we have any questions at this point?
Yes, we do. We have two right now. First one, how much may results vary with different extraction procedures and or HPLC methods?
That's perfect timing. That's going to be my next slide.
Okay, and maybe then the next question might be even kind of backing up a little bit. What are the drying and crushing protocol Pride uses to prep samples?
So drying, we dry the samples for a minimum of 4 hours at 70 degrees Celsius. That is a procedure that we got from the Wisconsin's Department of Ag Regulatory Lab. And being that we are in Wisconsin and ultimately all of our customers are going to be going for a certificate of commerce, and they're using our services as a way to gauge where they are in that THC development process, we want to make sure that our methods match the Wisconsin Department of Ag as closely as possible. So we use the Department of Ag's drying procedure, which is 70 degrees, minimum of 4 hours, maximum of 16 hours. Our crushing procedure, there we just use we put latex gloves on our hands and we crush them up with our fingers. We found that's the best way to keep all the trichomes on the sample and not, if you use a coffee grinder or if you use any other kind of grinder, you destroy all of those trichomes and you leave them behind in the grinder itself. There is quite a bit of subjectivity and this is coming down to the standardization of the procedures that I was talking about earlier. Drying and crushing is part of the procedure that people are hoping to standardize. And Eva and Scott, please feel free to jump in on any of these questions as well. So question of variability. The best way to answer that is as long as a lab is doing things properly, variability should be fairly minimal. Variability from sample to sample usually is mostly inherent in the sample itself. So I will caution if anybody wants to do a comparison among labs, the important thing to do is send the entirety of a sample to one laboratory, ask them to do the prep procedure. So that is get it through the drying and crushing up to the subsampling. And here at the subsampling, that's where you would want to send it off to multiple laboratories. If you were to send it off to multiple laboratories from the field, that data will not be useful for you because there's so much variability in the actual sample that's pulled. But looking at the variability among laboratories, what we see here is data from the University of Kentucky's Hemp Proficiency Program. This is from their first year, which was 2018. I do not have the data from 2019, but the program sends out 4 homogenized samples throughout the season to each participating lab. So what you see here, these are all the laboratories that reported for sample 1. These are all the laboratories that reported for sample 2. Here are all the labs for sample 3 and all the labs for sample 4. And you can see that there is a pretty significant spread. It is inherent in analytics that as a value gets higher, the spread gets larger. But when we're looking at this threshold of 0.3, and now we have one sample in the proficiency program that's at that critical threshold, you can see more than half the samples are above that 0.3 and several are below that 0.3. So the spread among laboratories can be really pretty significant. And this is exactly why the University of Kentucky began this hemp proficiency testing program, so that all of the labs can see how we are comparing to one another, and we can start to rein this in a little bit. Some of the biggest issues that we've seen that contribute to this error, we did see a surge of startup laboratories in 2018, folks who thought that they would be able to get it going in relatively short notice. And that was driven largely by some equipment manufacturers that were offering a quote turnkey solution where you just unbox this HPLC and now you've got a laboratory. Turns out there's a lot more involved in that. And as a result of this data here, Eva and I both worked very closely with Kentucky's Division of Regulatory Services lab to develop and validate our method that we're using. We figured that the University of Kentucky is going to be the leader in what's happening out there. And they're the ones that got us in touch with AOAC and subsequently led to us both being on that committee. Any questions before I move on? That's kind of all the background on testing, and now we'll start getting into what we actually saw in 2019.
No questions. We're doing good.
All right. So 2019 turned out to be a pretty busy year for us. We opened the doors on our testing in mid to late July of 2019, and the sample volume started ramping up fairly quickly. So what we see here on this graph is each bar is a week. So the date that you see at the bottom is the Monday of that week. So this is the week of September 2nd, the week of September 9th, and so on. The height of the bar is the number of samples that we received that week. So not a really big surprise that we were seeing a pretty steady increase of samples as we approached harvest. As that DAP-CAP harvest and testing was coming, people definitely wanted to know where exactly they stand and where they're at. And also not a big surprise that as people started to get their certificates of commerce, those samples started to taper off. So over the course of the weeks that you see here, we analyzed about 2,600 samples. And even through the winter, it did not fall off completely. We continued to test for extractors, we continued to test biomass that was being sold, and we continued to test for greenhouse growers. So here is the number of samples by variety. So kind of an indication of what were the most popular varieties that came through our laboratory. And Abacus was far and away the most popular one, at least here in southeastern Wisconsin. T2 was a pretty close follower. Cherry Wine Lifter, these are pretty much all of the names that you would expect to see. So this is really ultimately what we wanted to get out of the data from 2019, is how does CBD progress throughout the growing season? We had heard that it's a curvilinear response, but we now actually have data to show that. So as we get closer to harvest, and again on the x-axis here we have a week and box whisker plot here. So in a given week, the bar across the center of the box is our median. Up and down is our 25th and 75th percentiles, and then the extensions of the whiskers are the max and min of what we had for that particular week. So if we just look at the bars, this is our median CBD content in that given week. And as we got to October, that CBD was really cranking up. We had folks testing week after week, and they were really, what this curve caused is toward harvest is when people started to see the CBD numbers that were being promised by their seed sellers. And that caused some of our customers to hold harvest and try and push that CBD content. But the danger there is that THC goes right along with CBD. So we look at the same plot for THC, and now this is total THC throughout the growing season. And if you're in Wisconsin, technically 0.4 was the limit. They had 0.3999 as the official limit. And as we got toward that October window, you can see our 75th percentile started to become illegal, and we started to move up above that 0.4 threshold. In the folks that were testing week over week, we did see a few folks that gained more than 0.1% total THC in just a matter of a week. So that pushing it to really push the CBD, it becomes riskier and riskier as time goes by. And that opportunity for harvest, that window of opportunity, gets narrower and narrower as the plant matures.
Hey, Scott, sorry, Dustin. Dustin, I do have a question for you here.
Sure.
Kind of going with this, and your previous slides talking about how samples and the number of sample submissions increased dramatically over that, August, September period. So now we're talking not only are more samples coming in, but people are really trying to push these harvests when the maturity to get as much CBD as possible. And so it's kind of like a double-edged sword here. What was the turnaround time to get these samples from when they get submitted to getting the information back out when you guys are getting swamped in August and September?
Yeah, that's a really good question. So we were in the thick of things here. We were trying to get a 48-hour turnaround. That was our goal. We had an equipment failure, of course, right when things were the busiest, and we wound up for a short time being at about 2.5 to 3 days, and that was definitely a bit too long of a turnaround for some folks because it was going up so fast. So we try to hold it to 48 hours. If we can, in 2020, we're going to try to get that down even a little bit lower. We'll do what we can.
That's great. Thank you very much. And I do have one more question that just came in as you were talking there. Did you see different cannabinoid accumulation trends when the data are plotted by variety?
I tried looking at that, and it became a really messy plot really quickly. And some of the difficulty we have in trying to really tease out trends by variety is we have to keep in mind that here, this 225 abacus samples, those could have been from, let's say, 10 growers that were testing weekly. The T2 samples the same. So the number of samples that we saw by variety did not necessarily correlate directly to individual plants by variety. So when I tried to start to tease things out by variety, things got pretty unreliable pretty quickly. But
I have to imagine that the seed source would contribute to that tremendously as well, not knowing necessarily where these seeds are coming from or what they're being claimed to be as a variety.
Absolutely, seed source, and also even just greenhouse versus field growth, or pollinated versus unpollinated samples. And unfortunately, we don't get that kind of data when samples are submitted to us. We don't know if it's in a greenhouse. We don't know if it's been pollinated. We don't know planting dates, so we can't really assess physiological maturity of any of the plants. So our data are pretty limited just based on what we're provided. All right, is that all the questions at the moment?
One more that just came in, but it's a good question too. Could the levels of THC, CBD, or the ratio vary based on variety, and then auto flower versus full season?
It could, yes, it definitely could be vary based on variety. And I've got a couple of slides coming up here that we can talk about that a little bit more in depth.
Great, thank you.
Sure. But ultimately, I think that's what we're all trying to figure out, is what really drives that CBD to THC ratio, because I don't think anybody really knows at the moment. So we do get the question of, did we get hot samples? And the answer is yes, we definitely got a lot of hot samples. So this is a plot of how many hot samples we received. So again, we're looking at the week on the x-axis here. The height of the bar in the red here, that's the percentage of samples that came through in a given week that were hot. And because the number of samples changed week to week, I also plotted it as a percent, which is our green line. So you can see what we'll call the hottest week, where more than 70% of the samples that came through were above that 0.4% THC. That was right at the transition from September to October. But we definitely got a lot of hot samples. Our hottest sample was 7%, and that's not what I call hemp. This is looking at the same plot, but this is, rather than just looking at summary statistics, this is every sample that actually came through plotted in a given week. And if you look at the density of samples, 0.4 is right about here on the line. The density of samples that are above that 0.4 is actually pretty significant. And this includes data from all states. So while we were pretty heavy on Wisconsin, we also have one of our U.S. locations is in Pennsylvania, and Pennsylvania really hit the ground running with their pilot program this year. and we received a lot of samples from that state. Also quite a few from Illinois and a few from Michigan as well. So getting to the question about THC to CBD ratio, many of you probably know the name Liz Benversi. She is a UW extension agent that's been very active in Wisconsin with the hemp pilot program. And she created a data sharing website in 2019. And when I looked at her data sharing website, I saw this relationship between total THC, which is on our y-axis, and total CBD, which is on our x-axis. And when I looked at this, two things really jumped out at me. The first was there seems to be some sort of a really strong linear relationship happening down here. And the second is there is absolute garbage going on up here. And I wanted to figure out what are these two distinct populations and how can we figure out which is which and what can we learn from them. So I sorted all of the samples that we had by their CBD to THC ratio. And this is a little bit of a busy graph, but really what you're looking at here is on our y-axis is a CBD to THC ratio of a given sample in our database, and on the x-axis is percent of samples that came through the laboratory. So by the time you get down to this area here, you have 100% of our samples represented. And you can see most of the samples that came through our laboratory from 14% up to 80%, they all fell in this window THC, CBD to THC ratio of about 20 to 30. So playing around with the data just a little bit, I was able to get down to this 15 to 30 is really what I would consider to be genetics that are bred for CBD production. And that accounted for approximately 71% of the samples that came through our lab. If that CBD to THC ratio was less than 15, that is genetics that was bred for THC production, and that was about 11% of the samples. What I still haven't really figured out yet is all of these samples over here, where the CBD to THC ratio is above 30. I don't really know exactly what caused that, but those are some pretty amazing plants if you're looking at if you're looking for total CBD production. So really what that breaks out to then is here, all of these goofy ones, these are in that CBD to THC ratio that's less than 15. So everything that's over here in this mess, this is all what I would consider to be weed. And if we take those out, then we get a really strong relationship of total THC to total CBD. Like the R squared on this of 0.94 is unheard of. That's like fake data. It's so good. But it makes sense if you really think back at the physiology of the plant. So looking at this, cannabinoid flow chart, CBG is what we call the mother cannabinoid, and CBD and THC both come from CBD. So the direction that byproduct or breakdown occurs is going to be based on the amount of THCA synthase or the amount of CBDA synthase. And it appears as though those are pretty well in a steady proportion in the hemp genetics that we saw in Wisconsin. So getting back to this slide, really what this relationship tells us is we have 94% confidence that if we're given the total CBD value, we can calculate the total THC value. So in Wisconsin, we've got the 0.39% THC. That means statistically, if you have a certificate of commerce, you are not going to be above 10% CBD. If we were able to get the law changed up to 1% total THC, then in theory, you would not be able to get above 25.5% CBD. And that's looking at well over 1,000 data points with a correlation of 0.94. So this is good to keep in mind if you are at a smoke shop and you see some smoke rolled flower or something that advertises 20% CBD and no THC detected, or less than 0.3% THC detected. I'd be suspicious of those analyses. Any questions before we move on to health and safety testing?
No,
All right. Oh, go ahead. Okay. So health and safety testing, this is far and away the most expensive testing that you have to do as a hemp producer. Right now, it is not being required by any governing body, FDA, USDA. Nobody's looking at this. Nobody's requiring it. But there are some pretty important tests that could be done. And probably not big surprises to anybody on this meeting. Heavy metals, microbial contamination, residual pesticides, residual solvents of if it's an extract of any kind. Mycotoxins are a pretty important thing to look at, and then contaminants. And these are the suite of tests that are generally required in medical and recreational cannabis in California, Oregon, Colorado, those places. Primary benefits of having this is saleability. So if you have a competing product on the shelf, two competing products, one has a certificate saying that it's passed all of these suite of tests, and then the next one doesn't have that, I would guess people are going to buy the one that has a certificate of being safe. This will also offer some form of legal protection, knowing that the product that's being put out to the general public has been tested for safety. And all of that ties into customer relations and just being a good person, making sure that you're not putting anything harmful out there for people to put into their bodies. But again, it's important to note that industrial hemp does not require this in any shape or form. So we do offer health and safety testing through a partner lab that we work with in Oregon. Very soon we'll be doing all of the health and safety testing on our hemp at our lab in Cathedral City, California. Some of the things that we've seen so far are, to be frank, a little bit scary to me. We've had so far only 24 of our customers have requested testing, and because nobody is requiring health and safety testing, there's nobody who has set any kind of safety limits on these analyses. So the safety limits that you see here on the orange lines, these are the action levels that were set by the California Bureau of Cannabis Control. So these are the safety guidelines for inhaled products in medical and recreational cannabis in the state of California. What you can see here is looking at lead contamination. We had a couple that were right at the threshold and a couple that were above the safe threshold. The one that really surprised me was cadmium. We seem to have an issue with cadmium in Wisconsin soils, and we're getting quite a bit of cadmium contamination in our hemp products. Arsenic, we had a couple that were above the safety thresholds, and mercury, we're totally safe when it comes to mercury in Wisconsin. If you look up the health effects of each one of these, cadmium is actually a pretty scary one that I don't think folks think about too much, but it can really cause a lot of chronic lung problems. And the scary, well, I'm not trying to scare everybody, but the thing about cadmium is the effects of it can take 10 to 15 years before they really kick in. So people may not even know that they're being harmed until it's too late. Looking at microbials, there's a lot of text. This is pretty text heavy over here on the right, but the lines here, again, there's nobody that's setting safe limits, but there is a document published by the Association of Public Health Laboratories. You may have heard of them. They've been fairly vocal in the COVID-19 issues as well. When we look at aerobic plate count, what this is we will essentially mix the sample with a pH buffered solution, and then we just put the solution or the resulting solution on a petri dish, and we just watch stuff grow. So this is just the total amount of stuff that grows on a petri dish from the sample. the safety thresholds that were set by the Association of Public Health Laboratories are actually so much lower than what we've seen in our results that you cannot see them on this graph. So what I had to do is I had to zoom way in before you can actually see where the upper safety thresholds are for aerobic plate count. The same thing goes for total mold and yeast count in the samples that we tested. The upper thresholds are so much lower than what we're seeing in these samples that I had to zoom really far in before you could actually see what are the safety thresholds. This is a larger concern for me, more for smokable flower, because everything that we see here is a biologic of some sort. It doesn't survive the extraction process. When we've done aerobic plate count and mold and yeast count on extracts, we've found that they come back clean with pretty much zero in there. One thing that we have not been testing, though, that may not make it through the extract process is this mycotoxins. And when we do our final Q&A session shortly here, we can have Eva elaborate a little bit on just exactly what mycotoxins are and what they can do to us. So mycotoxins may make it through the extraction process. We don't really know. The good news, though, is the microbials do not. The other good news is all of these heavy metals can be remediated through the extraction process. And to be perfectly honest with you, I don't know exactly how that's done. I just know from talking with our lab in California that it is a common thing to have done in edibles and other recreational products in California. My understanding is it's not very inexpensive, but there is a way to fix it. So what's next with laboratories? One thing that we've been working with, Scott and I and Eva have been actually pretty active in working with our Wisconsin state lawmakers and trying to, we've presented all of this data to them, as well as engaged in pretty good discussion with them as to what's the hemp industry about right now and where should it go. So the things that we're thinking about for the hemp industry is some sort of a regulation on laboratories. Vertical integration of laboratories is something that we're not crazy about, where a laboratory is also your processor. So you have the same person that's buying your product also giving you the valuation of your product. That's not a good situation to be in. And also safety testing. We really want the public to be safe, and we want the growers to be protected from having any kind of issues with making people sick or anything like that. And I think safety testing has been largely overlooked in the industry. So we're trying to get the Association of Public Health Laboratories document into the hands of lawmakers to try to at least make sure that both growers and consumers are protected. And with that, that's everything that we've seen in 2019. If you guys have additional questions on anything else that we may have seen, I very well could have the data right here at my fingertips. Otherwise, we'll open it up. Any in-field related questions would be great for Scott. Methodology questions or laboratory type questions would be great for Eva. And data questions could come to me.
Yeah, we got a few in the chat box right now. Do the samples represent the same sample in all data? If so, it appears a few samples were consistently elevated in the heavy metals data.
I think I know what the question is. So yes, sample 6 here is also sample 6 here, is also sample 6 here. So I wasn't really able to find a strong correlation, you know, with the exception of sample 13 here seemed to be high in just about everything with the exception of mercury. But no, I did try to find some sort of a relationship between levels in one heavy metal compared to levels of another heavy metal.
Maybe not necessarily within, you know, areas, but location within the state. Where were most of these samples coming in from for these heavy metals?
Unfortunately, that's information that doesn't typically come to us.
Okay.
Can I hop in here, Dustin, for a second?
Yeah, fire away.
That's a great question though, Phillip. I did see, Scott Fleming here, the field guy with Rockerville Lab. I did see certain areas of Wisconsin, maybe some of the lead region that did show slightly higher lead levels. And anecdotally from growers, they were also finding high lead levels in their plants that were grown close to highways. Some of the theory there is that the leaded fuel from many years ago was depositing lead in that field, and those plants were accumulating that lead in the growing process. They had said that they're definitely looking to move their smokable flower especially away from highways to try and avoid that lead that was deposited in the air.
Yeah, this brings up an interesting perspective, though, on these microbials, on heavy metals, and something that we've discussed a lot with growers in this industry, just regarding smokable flower and where and how it's going to have to be grown. A lot more labor intensive, a lot more selective, and perhaps even shifting indoors to eliminate a lot of these issues if it's not going to be going for extraction and remediation. So a lot of interesting information that you guys are talking about here. It's very, very important for people to understand. More questions coming in here as we go. Can you talk about the effects of when the hemp tests high for metals?
Is that the medical effects?
I believe so.
Okay. So bear in mind, I'm not an expert in this, and I did try to dig into this a little bit, but the research is almost overwhelming. And Eva, your experience in an environmental lab, feel free to jump in if you've got something to add. But I believe smoking lead is going to be the same as eating lead paint, where it'll impact your cognitive abilities. Cadmium its primary focus is going to be on the lungs, and anecdotally, cadmium was also looked at as a chemical agent in World War II by the United States, but ultimately not used. Arsenic, I don't actually know the effect of arsenic on the body. I think it may have something to do with the heart. And mercury is, again, comes back to cognitive function.
So one question here, actually, the question about the effects was actually regarding marketing effects and salability. I jumped the gun there, Dustin, so I apologize. So the question,
No
how
worries.
does heavy metals impact marketing and salability of the product?
Well, again, that comes down to if you have two competing products on the shelf and one has a certificate that it's free of heavy metals where the other does not, I believe that the one that has the certificate is going to outsell the one that does not more often than not. We are also a member of the Wisconsin Hemp Farmers and Manufacturers Association, and something that they are trying to do through that association is to offer this suite of testing for their members through us at a discounted rate. And through the association, if you've got these tests that show that it's a clean product, you'd be able to put the association's badge directly on your product. And it may even go as far as to having smoke shops or hemp dispensaries having the WIFMA logo right on the building. So inside, right on the entry door or something like that. So you know that anything that's going to be sold inside that building is going to be free of harmful contaminants.
Another question. Anything to learn from the USDA guidelines for use of CBD grain for animal food in the future? CBD or grain for animal food in the future?
In terms of, does the guideline offer any guidance there? I'm going to say no. The USDA still says that cannot be done. And the important thing here to remember too is that we have several departments that are kind of overlapping one another. You have the USDA who controls the growing of hemp, but then you have the FDA who controls administering hemp to humans or to animals. So the USDA and the FDA have both said right now it's not legal to give this material to animals. I know of a couple of different groups that are conducting studies either with or without the USDA to try to actually put some scientific data behind it and ultimately force the FDA and USDA to make a ruling on this. But as of right now, it stands that it's illegal.
Just have a follow-up, and I understand that this is not really your area here, but what is really the concern there from a perspective of use of this for animal food? Is it that THC and the cannabinoids will accumulate in the grain and then be used for the animal feed and then also for human feed? Is that kind of the concern there, or what's come in your discussions there?
Scott, you maybe have heard more about this, or Eva, but I would say that it's more just the bureaucracy of the federal government is that no studies have been done. So if there's no information, they're not going to make a ruling. I don't know that anybody has any particular fears or anything like that. It's just that there is nothing to base anything off of. So they're just going to leave it alone.
Okay. Thank you very much. All right. What sample prep comes after drying and crushing?
Eva, do you want to take that?
Yeah, I can jump in here. Hi, I'm Eva. What we need to do after the sample is dried and crushed is goes through a process called extraction, which is similar to, what happens in the long run to extract your CBD and THC out. Usually it's done with a solvent of some kind, which should sound familiar as well. So we mix the solvent with a portion of sample, and it is mechanically shaken for between 5 and 8 minutes. And after that, the sample settles, we filter it, and it can be analyzed on the HPLC.
Okay, thank you. Can you discuss overview of remediation methods for THC or other contaminants discussed? Dustin, I know you said you don't know specifically, but you know where they might be able to look to get a little more information about that.
So remediation of THC.
Oh, sorry, yes. Remediation or other contaminants is in the question as well.
Sure, yep. Scott or Eva, you might know more about the other contaminants. THC, the only way that I know to remediate that is to use industrial scale chromatography and turn your, first I'll say for smokable flower or any natural form of the product, there is no remediation. The only remediation is to go through a chemical process in which you either isolate the CBD and you wind up with isolate, or go through industrial scale chromatography and turn your full spectrum into broad spectrum by essentially, it's the exact same process that we use in the testing, where the chromatography, what it does is it separates all the cannabinoids out, where they start out as just a jumbled mess, like I'll call it a wad of cannabinoids, and the chromatography separates them all out. So then all of the CBDA is together, all of the delta-9 THC is together, all of the THCA is together. It just so happens that delta-9 THC and THCA separate out to kind of together at the very end of the chromatography. So there is a way using pretty expensive instrumentation that you can get all of the cannabinoids and then right at the end, divert your stream and throw away all the THC. And again, with heavy metals, I don't know of a way that you can do that. Scott, I think it has something to do with extreme cold temperatures or something. Have you heard anything about that?
Yeah, I think a lot of it is proprietary, and that's the answer I tend to get.
Yeah.
I might look towards WIFMA too. I think they're doing some work in that avenue.
Yeah, I think that's right.
What analysis methods do you use for heavy metals?
Eva, you want to step in on that one?
The heavy metals analysis is typically done by ICP analysis. A lot of times that's coupled with a mass spec, so ICP MS. It does involve the sample being digested as well, which the instrumentation part is kind of what makes it so expensive for the testing.
And that would be like a total acid digestion where the sample is boiled in acid until it's nothing but a liquid.
All right, I got a lengthy one here, so I might have to repeat it. But also, well, what have you noticed when you match the soil testing to the safety testing? That is, have you determined the maximum levels for soil that will keep the levels tested for hemp grown in it below the recommended smoking levels? So what would be a parts per million, maybe soil level that would correlate to an acceptable range to grow hemp? We know the hemp has high uptake of whatever is in the soil, so maybe some recommended soil levels.
Yeah, that's the $1 billion question. If somebody can figure that one out, they'll be sitting pretty.
Casey better write a grant, I think.
I think you're right. Yep. And that actually does lead into a point that I forgot to make earlier, is that we all know that hemp really luxuriously consumes all the garbage that's in soil. And we have had some growers here in 2020 preemptively test their soil for heavy metal levels. So that while that's great, the caution that I give folks is we have no idea what the how to interpret the data for heavy metals in soils. The only soil that I could say is probably certainly safe is something that comes back with no heavy metals detected at all. But that is a burning industry burning question in the industry right now.
Cattle do not seem interested in consuming feral hemp. What part is potentially being used as animal feed? Scott, that question, that's going to be grain, typically the grain or some use as an animal feed or an additive, if not in whole. It's being done in other countries. It's high protein, fatty acids, omega-3s. So that's where the interest is. From Jen, with the herbicide testing, do you test for atrazine and glyphosate? I don't typically see these listed. Why or why not? And can Ava elaborate on the mycotoxins possibly remaining?
Eva, do you want to talk about the herbicide testing, or do you want me to take that part?
Well, unless you have a clear answer, but I could assume that as of right now, there are no application recommendations. So if you don't have an application recommendation, they're not going to test for it.
Right, and also the real, I guess the snarky answer is you can test for whatever you want to pay for. There are tests for glyphosate and atrazine. The difficulty comes in that you can test chemicals that have similar makeup more or less together. So there are a lot of herbicides out there that have a very similar makeup, and that's one extraction, one instrument, and you can get 20 different pesticides on there. Glyphosate has a very different makeup from everything else, so that's going to require a completely different instrument and a completely different test method. So yes, we can add glyphosate to any test, but it also adds, I think, $150 to the test. Then we can add atrazine, which will add another $225, and so on and so forth. So if you really, really want to get into it, you can spend a lot of money and ultimately have a complete suite. To the second part, Eva, do you want to elaborate a bit about the mycotoxins?
Yeah, so mycotoxins are a product of mold and fungi growing. So even if you can remove the mold through remediation, the mycotoxins that are left behind are sometimes harder to break down. So we haven't typically seen a lot of mycotoxin testing done yet, although I do feel like that's going to be coming down the pipe. For example, let's say you have a high concentration of Aspergillus mold growing. That could potentially cause a byproduct of a mycotoxin called aflatoxin. Aflatoxin is highly regulated by the FDA in all food that is consumed by humans. So there definitely could be an issue there with consumable products with CBD in them that aren't really being screened for right now, or we don't have any limits on from the FDA. I don't know if you had any other particular questions about what kind of molds lead to what kind of toxins, but I have some of that information available.
Eva, which mold makes aflatoxin?
Aspergillus.
Aspergillus.
Mm-hmm.
And forgive me, I'm not sure if you said this or not, but just to, I guess, drive home the importance of safety testing, particularly in smokable flower. Aflatoxin, let me back up and say that I think it's I can't remember the group, but there was a group that lists the strength of carcinogens, and the carcinogens found in cigarettes are considered to be the premier carcinogen. Aflatoxin is 200 times stronger than that carcinogen. So the aflatoxins, they don't just make you ill, like if you're food poisoning or something like that, but an aflatoxin can cause very serious and very deadly cancers and other illnesses. So when and if the FDA does weigh in on giving hemp to animals or giving hemp to for human consumption, it's almost certain that aflatoxin and other mycotoxin testing is going to be required.
Wow. Moving on, you said that microbials do not survive extraction. Is that true for all forms of extraction? Is the decarbing process that removes those microbials? Is it the decarbing process that removes those microbials?
I cannot say for certain that like supercritical CO2 will get rid of it, but and it's not the decarboxylation as much as it is the ethanol or the methanol or whatever type of organic solvent is being used for the extractant. Ethanol is what's used in hand sanitizer, and nothing can survive being boiled in it or submerged in ethanol for extended periods of time. So essentially, any kind of organic solvent extraction more or less sterilizes the material.
I'm sorry. Does HPLC measure the pesticides? Since it looks like pesticides do not show up in the data, should we even test for that?
Eva, you want to go with that one?
Yeah. To answer the first part of the question, HPLC coupled with mass spectrometry usually gives the pesticide results. That can be a list that is typically mandated by the state. You could have a list of 250 different pesticides, or your state might only require that you screen for 8 of them. So it really depends on if you're asking for a pesticide test. You kind of want to do your research and find out which ones are required or which ones you are most interested in. And that kind of moves into the second part of the question. Pesticide testing is definitely going to depend on whatever regulations come down and like I mentioned before, that is typically done at the state level. So I know the partner lab that we're using right now in Oregon, they offer a Oregon list of pesticides that they test for. They do offer a extended list, but with the more compounds that you're analyzing for, they always want to increase the price tag. So that's definitely something that I think as a producer, you might want to do your homework on and find out, which ones are required or not.
Any other questions for our guest today?
I've got one last comment on pesticides, especially, the higher doses of Roundup, is the plant is going to show us if it has those problems. It will, it could possibly pick up very low doses of like atrazine or a Roundup in the soil, but the chances of having quite a bit in that plant are pretty bad. The plant isn't going to grow if it's very, very intolerant of actually most commercial herbicides. It doesn't take much to kill it with a herbicide, oddly enough. For such a strong, robust plant, herbicides definitely do it in quite quickly. So they, like I was saying, they do show you if they do have pesticides in them.
Yeah, so if you had material to harvest, there probably were not any herbicides in your soil.
Is there a basic health and safety panel recommended for smokable flower? That's a great question.
Yes, and it'd be the one that we offer. And Eva, I can't remember everything that's in that. Can you help me?
Yes, that is a screen of, we do the aerobic play count. It does have, I believe, the E. coli included, as well as heavy metals, and the short pesticide list from Oregon right now is the one that we offer, along with the potency.
Yeah, and mold and yeast is in that as well.
Yep.
Any last questions? Oh, here we go. What is the cost for that panel?
That's $525.
Yeah, and I do think that's in Dustin's PowerPoint, he shared a link to the guide that we were using for safety.
Yep, so on the screen here for heavy metals, again, that one comes from the California Bureau of Cannabis Control. So this is this link right here. I don't think you'll be able to click on it in the materials, but I'll leave it up on this page. So if you guys want to write it down, this is going to tell you, as far as the state of California is concerned, all the tests that should be run and what are the acceptable thresholds for, as it says here, inhaled medical cannabis goods. So this is essentially smokable flower. And I'll give just a couple minutes for people to jot that down if they want it, and then I'll switch to the next slide that has the link for, oh, Scott just had a good idea that I can copy that and paste it into the chat box. So this is what you'll get when you go there. And find the chat box here. Okay, so there we go in the chat box for California Bureau of Medical Control, or Cannabis Control. And then do the same thing here for This is the Association of Public Health Laboratories. And this is where you can find actually, this is a really large document, 36 pages. And here it has guidelines for just about everything and every use of cannabis. I'm scrolling really quickly here to show you guys what the lists are. Okay. So here it splits your products out by use. So chopped or powdered botanicals, and then it gives you a definition. Then it gives you the limits if you're going to be using it that way. Tinctures, infusions, so on and so forth. So this is actually a pretty cool document if you guys have some time to scroll through. Again, this is a document that was produced by the Association of Public Health Laboratories specifically for state lawmakers as they bring medical cannabis programs online in their individual states.
Great. That is a fantastic resource. Thank you for sharing that.
Sure.
Any last comments or questions for our guests? Actually, here we go. Yeah. Once someone runs the health and safety panel on smokable flower grown in their soil, would that one-time test provide some long-term assurance that their soil is good to go? Stacy, you got some tough ones today.
Scott, that sounds like it's one of yours.
It sounded like a Dustin to me. I don't think we have enough research to know what is a safe soil level to, really make that assumption. I think you're on the right track, but I'm not going to stake my professional prowess on that comment. Dustin, can you elaborate?
Well, we know a couple of things that we can use. So herbicides and pesticides are organic compounds that have really very short half-lives in the soil. So, for example, glyphosate that's applied in growing season 2019 is going to be essentially non-detectable in the soil in the year 2020. So your number one resource for the safety of the soil is going to be field history. If you know what's been applied to the crops in that field in subsequent years, Google can tell you what the half-life is of that particular product in a typical soil under typical weather conditions. So you can use some math and research to figure out whether or not it's even a concern. So that's looking at applied product. When it comes to heavy metals are pervasive in the soil. That's where they come from. So, if you were to test your soil this year and see that it's completely clear of, this won't happen, but that's completely clear of lead, cadmium, and such, you can be pretty sure that it's not going to magically create lead or cadmium over the next year. But if your soil does show that it has some amounts of lead or cadmium, it's biological processes and weather that dictate how much of those particular minerals are released from the soil in any given season or any given time of the year. So, saying that you have lead in your soil today, but it's just below the safe threshold does not mean that you will stay below the safe threshold, if it becomes really sunny or if it rains really heavy, things like that. And it really comes back to what Scott said, is we don't really know how to interpret soil tests for this yet.
All right, I think that's going to be wrapping everything up here today. I would like to say thank you very much to our guests from Rock River Labs and Pride Analytics for coming in. Eva, Dustin, Scott, thank you so much. This has probably been one of the most informative webinars. I've been a part of this last year, just giving this information out, and it's something I'm definitely going to be sharing, with our growers as we move forward here. And I encourage those listeners to do the same. This is a lot of important information for growers making informational decisions based on what type of hemp they're going to grow and where they're going to go with it. And if they're growing smokable flower, I think there's a lot of things in here that people need to understand. So thank you so much. This recording will be available online at our website following the program. And I would like to promote our next grower spotlight coming up this Friday with the Sulcana Grower Cooperative out of Hanover. But thank you so much to you guys for coming. Any last comments and how we can get a hold of you would be very much appreciated.
Yeah, thank you very much for having us. This is very important. We want to make sure that the testing process is as transparent as possible for the growers and the consumers. And right now, we do not have an active Pride Analytics and Consulting website. It's being built, but you can certainly find contact information and more resources at rockriverlaboratory.com. We've got a hemp page there, a landing page that gives some more information on how to collect samples and what to do with your results.
I just put that in the chat box.
Oh, great. And there you'll also find my email address, Scott's email address, and Eva's email address. And certainly feel free to reach out if you think of more questions.
All right. Well, great. Thank you so much for joining today's episode of the Hemp Grower Spotlight. We will see you next time. Take care.
All right, thanks for having us. Goodbye.
Thank you, everyone.